The Ashford twins are some of the most brilliant and most terrifying characters in all of Resident Evil. But their story doesn't start with madness or experiments or even the T-Veronica virus. It starts with a family dynasty and a fall so devastating it created two children who would reshape the entire future of Umbrella. Most fans know Alfred and Alexia from Code Veronica, Rockfort Island, the split identity, the awakening. But the truth goes much deeper. Their lineage ties directly into the birth of Umbrella, the death of its founders, and a virus unlike anything the world had ever seen. Whether you're listening to relax, to study, or to fall asleep, this will be a calm journey. No loud jump scares, no harsh audio, just a complete, beginning-to-end history of the Ashford family and the twin prodigies who nearly brought humanity to extinction. Let's start at the very beginning, long before the twins were born, with the rise of the Ashford legacy. Part 1. The Ashford lineage and founding of Umbrella. To understand how the world ended up with the T-Veronica virus, a weapon more dangerous and unstable than anything before it, you have to go back to the beginning, to the founding of the Umbrella Corporation, and specifically the Ashford family. The Ashford lineage was ancient, aristocratic, and obsessed with genetics and eugenics for centuries. We're talking European nobility who saw themselves as biologically superior, which is exactly why they were the perfect partner for this dark company. The true story of Umbrella starts with three founders, not just one. There was Oswell E. Spencer, the mastermind and financier, driven by a vision of creating a new world elite. Then there was James Marcus, the brilliant but unstable microbiologist, obsessed with using viruses to control nature. And finally, there was Edward Ashford, the patriarch of the noble Ashford family. Edward Ashford's role was crucial. He was the one who provided the initial, massive scientific credibility and funding to get the whole thing off the ground. The Ashfords already had generations of research into biology and genetics, so they brought the expertise and the prestigious name. In 1968, the three men formally established the Umbrella Corporation, setting it up as a legitimate, benevolent pharmaceutical company. But here's the key difference. Edward Ashford's family history, his centuries-long obsession with finding the perfect human, aligned perfectly with Spencer's own twisted goals of achieving superiority through viral evolution. They weren't just founding a company, they were creating a biological cult dedicated to achieving evolutionary perfection through any means necessary, using their pharmaceutical cover to fund their secret, terrifying research. Edward ensured the Ashford name would be immortalized, or so he thought, at the very foundation of this new bioenterprise. The partnership was unstable from day one. You had three extremely powerful, extremely arrogant men with massive egos, all trying to steer the direction of the most dangerous scientific discovery in history. Edward helped lay the groundwork, but his presence quickly became a threat to Spencer, who only ever wanted total, absolute control. The Ashford legacy was built on pride and ambition, and that ambition is exactly what led them down the path of genetic engineering and eventually complete ruin. Part 2, Edward Ashford and the Progenitor, research before the T-virus. The thing that created the classic zombies. There was the Progenitor virus, and the initial brutal research into this virus is where Edward Ashford truly left his mark, just before Spencer took everything. The story starts in 1966. Edward Ashford, Oswell E. Spencer, and James Marcus organized a dangerous secret expedition into West Africa. They were hunting for the source of a powerful, mysterious organism they had read about in ancient texts. What they found was a rare, highly specific flower, the stairway of the sun, which contained the progenitor virus in its pollen and cells. This virus was incredibly volatile and powerful. It's what started everything. It was the biological catalyst that could cause massive, immediate mutagenic effects in test subjects. But here's the problem. It was almost always fatal. Injecting a human with the raw progenitor virus rarely resulted in a controllable BOW. It usually just caused rapid, messy death. Edward Ashford's contribution at this crucial early stage was purely scientific. While Spencer was managing the logistics and planning how to market the thing, and Marcus was back at the Arklay laboratory, focused obsessively on using leeches as vectors, Edward focused on the paperwork and the data. He meticulously documented the virus's incredibly destructive mutagenic effects, and most importantly, the extremely rare survivability factor. This was the key insight. A tiny percentage of subjects, usually due to specific genetic markers, could survive the progenitor infection and gain superhuman traits. This documentation was fundamental to the later development of the entire Resident Evil universe. Edward's work essentially proved the hypothesis that viruses could be used to create the evolutionary superior race that he and Spencer dreamed of. His careful research laid the groundwork that allowed Marcus to later combine Progenitor with other elements, eventually leading to the slightly more stable T-virus. Edward was obsessed with this perfect life form, and his dedication to the research in those early days provided the scientific validation Umbrella needed. This dedication, unfortunately, blinded him to the growing threat right next to him, his partner, Oswell E. Spencer. Part 3. Edward's mysterious death and Spencer's takeover. The partnership between the three founders, Edward Ashford, Oswell E. Spencer, and James Marcus, was never going to last. It was built on a massive lie and driven by three separate, ruthless ambitions. But the end for Edward came shockingly fast, cementing the brutal truth that Umbrella was always a corporation ruled by the most cunning and ruthless individual. Edward Ashford died under mysterious circumstances shortly after the official founding of Umbrella in 1968. He had barely settled into his role as co-founder. The official, corporate cover story was exactly what you'd expect. A tragic lab accident involving the newly discovered progenitor virus. It was a neat, believable death that immediately shut down any further inquiry. But here's the thing. Almost everyone who knew the inner workings of Umbrella, and especially those who knew Spencer, suspected a far darker truth. Edward's death was just too convenient. With Edward gone, Spencer immediately seized the opportunity to solidify his control. Edward was a major shareholder and a scientific rival, possessing the same vision of a biologically engineered new world as Spencer, which made him dangerous. By removing Edward, Spencer effectively eliminated a powerful check on his authority, ensuring that the company's massive resources and secret goals would be dictated entirely by his own will. Edward's quick demise was a fatal blow to the Ashford branch of the founding family. It took the Ashford name, their funding, and their scientific genius out of the immediate decision-making process. The Ashford legacy was suddenly left rudderless, inherited by Edward's son, Alexander, who was utterly unprepared for the ruthless corporate war that had just claimed his father. This event is not just a footnote. It's the first great betrayal that defines the corporate history of Umbrella. It proves that Umbrella's core values were not science or profit, but absolute, brutal control. Edward's life's work, his dedication to the progenitor research, and his ancestral obsession with eugenics, was stolen and repurposed by Spencer in a single, fatal move. This left the Ashford family with a deep, consuming sense of injury and a desperate need for revenge and relevance. which would tragically fall upon the shoulders of Edward's disappointing son. Part 4. Alexander Ashford, the desperate heir. After his father, Edward, was suddenly removed from the picture by what everyone suspects was Spencer's ruthless plotting, the Ashford legacy fell to his son, Alexander Ashford. This poor guy immediately found himself in an impossible position, struggling desperately to maintain the family's prestige in a company that saw him as completely expendable. Alexander was, to put it simply, not a genius. He inherited a seat on the umbrella board, a vast fortune, and his family's terrifying ambition. But he lacked the essential, driving scientific brilliance of the other founders. He was constantly living in the shadow of his brilliant, murdered father and the towering intellects of Spencer and James Marcus. This gap between his heritage and his capability led to a consuming, almost frantic obsession with restoring the Ashford family's status. He felt like the weakest link in the chain, and he hated it. His entire career became a series of desperate, self-defeating attempts to prove himself worthy. He focused heavily on genetic engineering projects, believing that if he couldn't replicate his father's viral genius, he could manufacture his own. His most ambitious and deranged project was the attempt to resurrect his famous ancestor, Veronica Ashford, a brilliant noblewoman from centuries past, using her preserved DNA. Alexander's labs were consumed by this failure. He wasted years and enormous amounts of umbrella resources trying to artificially create the perfect human that his ancestors had idealized. All his projects, including the Veronica Resurrection Project, were consistently viewed as expensive, time-wasting failures by the rest of the corporation. Spencer, in particular, saw Alexander as a weak, incompetent heir whose only value was providing access to the Ashford money and facilities. This constant corporate ridicule and personal desperation were the driving forces that pushed Alexander toward his ultimate, tragic decision. He became so desperate to restore the family name that he decided the only way to succeed was to engineer his own genius heirs. He couldn't be the perfect Ashford, so he would literally create them. This desperation, this need to prove he wasn't a failure, is the emotional key to understanding the horrific cruelty that would follow, setting the stage for the creation of his own genetically engineered twin children, Alexia and Alfred. Part 5. The creation of T-Veronica virus. Alexander Ashford's desperation to restore his family's name, combined with the extreme genetic engineering he performed, led directly to his children. But it was his daughter, Alexia Ashford, who finally achieved the breakthrough that had eluded all three umbrella founders, creating the infamous T-Veronica virus, a key turning point in the entire Ashford downfall. Alexia was a terrifying prodigy. By the time she was only 10 years old, she had already outstripped her father's scientific capabilities and essentially became the lead researcher for the Ashford branch of Umbrella. She was the genius Alexander had engineered, and she immediately despised him for his failure. Using her astonishing intellect, Alexia discovered a new, more powerful way to manipulate the progenitor virus. Her research involved a strange combination. She introduced a highly specific insect virus into an ant queen's retrovirus, and then, most crucially, combined this resulting biological soup with Umbrella's core progenitor samples. The result was the T-Veronica virus. Now here's why the T-Veronica virus is such a big deal. It was exponentially more potent and dangerous than the standard T virus that caused the classic zombie outbreak. T-Veronica granted test subjects things like enhanced intelligence, immense super strength, and the bizarre ability to manipulate fire. This seemed to be the evolutionary breakthrough the Ashfords had sought for centuries. But there was a massive problem. It was incredibly unstable. Injecting a human with T-Veronica usually resulted in immediate monstrous mutation and a complete loss of consciousness, making it unusable as a bioweapon that retained intelligence. Alexia's genius lay in the creation of the virus, but her ultimate success depended on solving this instability problem. This scientific roadblock is what would ultimately lead her to the most extreme measure possible: self-experimentation and a 15-year wait. The creation of T-Veronica was the high point of the Ashford name, but it simultaneously guaranteed the end of their entire line, fueled by the sheer hubris and cruelty of a 10-year-old genius. Part 6. The artificial twins, Alfred and Alexia, are born. The story of Alfred and Alexia Ashford is not the story of a normal childhood. It's a terrifying story of genetic arrogance and scientific hubris taken to the absolute extreme. They were not naturally conceived children. They were the direct, tragic result of their father, Alexander Ashford's insane attempt to restore his family's prestige after his own failures. He couldn't be the genius the company wanted, so he decided he would simply manufacture one. Alexander's goal was simple: to create genetically engineered, genius-level heirs who would possess the perfect biological and intellectual foundation to inherit the Ashford name and, more importantly, lead Umbrella. To do this, he utilized advanced genetic engineering techniques, attempting to replicate the DNA of his famous ancestor, Veronica Ashford, believing her genetic sequence held the key to true brilliance. This led to the birth of the twins, Alexia and Alfred. From the moment they were born, they were recognized as anomalies. Alexia, in particular, was terrifyingly brilliant. She was confirmed to have an IQ of 300, a number that signifies a mind operating on a completely different plane from the rest of humanity. Alfred, while possessing a high IQ, was considered the weaker, less intellectually dominant twin, immediately setting up a cruel, lifelong dynamic of worship and dependency on his sister. But here's the fundamental, unavoidable problem. Alexander engineered them for scientific greatness, but he completely stripped them of humanity. They were raised in a sterile, isolated, and almost clinical environment, groomed entirely for research and leadership, but lacking normal human development and social interaction. They grew up in a bubble, primarily overseen by a butler and their father, who treated them less like children and more like living experiments. This complete isolation, combined with their engineered superiority complex, contributed massively to their severe psychological instability and emerging sociopathic tendencies. The very essence of their being was artificial. Their lives were dedicated to science because that was the only identity they were engineered to understand. They saw themselves as the ultimate answer to the Ashford family's centuries-long quest for biological perfection. This immense engineered intellect meant they grasped complex concepts before they could tie their own shoes. But it also meant they never developed empathy, compassion, or restraint. They were tools of genius, not people. This engineered, unnatural birth meant they bypassed all the normal constraints of human development. They were not capable of forming natural bonds with their father, who they eventually discovered was nothing more than their failed creator. This knowledge, coupled with their extreme intelligence, provided them with the perfect justification for the horrors they would later inflict. They became the ultimate irony of the Ashford line, the culmination of their genetic dreams, but also the seeds of their final, catastrophic downfall, fueled by the sheer hubris of manufacturing genius without manufacturing a soul. The legacy of their birth is a cautionary tale within the Umbrella story. It proves that simply possessing massive intellect is useless, or worse, dangerous, without the tempering influence of a normal environment and human development. Alexander achieved his goal of producing genius heirs, but in doing so, he unleashed two sociopathic monsters on the world, ensuring the destruction of the very corporate structure he desperately sought to rejoin. The twins were the living embodiment of the phrase, "Be careful what you wish for." Part 7. Childhood, Isolation, and Psychological Damage. The psychological damage inflicted upon Alexia and Alfred Ashford during their childhood is perhaps more horrifying than any viral mutation. They were raised in extreme, unnatural isolation, primarily confined to the remote and desolate Rockfort Island and the even more frigid, empty facilities of the Antarctic base. This isolation wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate consequence of their engineered genius and their father's frantic need to conceal his Veronica Resurrection Project failure. Imagine being a child with an IQ of 300, capable of processing the world at light speed, but having no one to talk to except your equally brilliant but emotionally stunted twin, a distant father who treats you like property, and a butler. The twins were fundamentally set apart from humanity by their intellect, and their environment ensured they would never learn normal social rules. They grew up without peers, without challenge outside the laboratory, and without the crucial feedback mechanism that teaches children empathy and morality. This extreme lack of human contact accelerated their natural sociopathic tendencies. Their games were cruel, their experiments were ruthless, and their view of the lower life forms around them, the staff and early test subjects, was utterly devoid of compassion. They only saw people as tools or subjects for their scientific amusement. Alexia, in particular, viewed every other human as beneath her, including her father and twin brother. This superiority complex was vast and utterly unchecked. This psychological environment created a feedback loop of escalating cruelty. On Rockfort Island, which Alfred was allowed to design and manage, the twins had their own private kingdom. They were the absolute rulers of a massive facility dedicated to the creation of biological weapons. They were given the power to inflict pain, fear, and death on test subjects without ever facing consequences. This complete freedom from moral and societal constraints is a major factor in the horrific actions they commit as adults. Alfred's experience of this isolation was particularly damaging. While Alexia poured her genius into the lab, successfully creating the T-Veronica virus and validating her existence, Alfred was left with a powerful sense of insecurity and inadequacy. He worshipped his sister's genius, recognizing he could never match her. This toxic dependency, combined with the lack of stable emotional development, created the first cracks in his fragile mind. He began to exhibit signs of severe mental instability, including violent mood swings and intense paranoia. The entire Ashford upbringing confirms a critical truth about the creation of bioweapons. The psychological damage inflicted on the creators is often as destructive as the virus itself. The isolation and the engineered genius didn't produce the perfect leader for Umbrella. It produced two broken, sadistic individuals whose only desire was to inflict their pain and superiority upon the world. The childhood of the Ashford twins was not merely tragic. It was the factory floor for their eventual madness. Part 8. Alexia's Obsession with Evolution. Alexia Ashford's entire short, brilliant, and terrifying life was defined by a singular consuming belief that she, through the power of her own intellect and the T-Veronica virus, had surpassed humanity itself. This wasn't just arrogance, it was an extreme, powerful obsession with biological evolution that led her to view all other life forms, including the Umbrella founders, as mere evolutionary relics. From the moment she achieved her breakthrough with the T-Veronica virus, Alexia saw herself as the final answer to the centuries-long Ashford quest for perfection. She saw the standard T virus, the source of the common zombies and monsters, as primitive, crude, and unstable. In her mind, the T virus was a biological blunt instrument, but T-Veronica was a weapon of elegant, intelligent mutation. Her goal was to become the ultimate life form, achieving a stable, controlled mutation that retained human consciousness and enhanced intelligence while gaining formidable biological powers. Her superiority complex was vast, and it fueled her ruthless experimentation. She viewed her test subjects, both human and animal, as nothing more than worthless, lower life forms. This perspective allowed her to conduct horrific, torturous experiments without a second thought. She was emotionally detached from suffering, focused only on the scientific data and the goal of perfecting her own viral integration. This is a critical point. She saw her victims not as people, but as biological waste products, necessary to fine-tune her own path to godhood. This obsession directly influenced her research priorities. She wasn't interested in mass production or profit, which were Spencer's concerns. Alexia was interested only in self-experimentation. She was determined to inject herself with the T-Veronica virus and achieve the stable mutation that everyone else had failed to find. She was convinced that her own unique, engineered genetic makeup was the key to unlocking the virus's true potential. Her research became a personal mission to transcend human biology. It's important to remember that Alexia was still just a child prodigy when she developed this virus and this mindset. Her genius gave her the power, and her engineered isolation gave her the cruelty. She was so convinced of her own unique superiority that she didn't just reject humanity. She actively sought to leave it behind through forced, viral evolution. She saw the entire world as her experimental playground and her own body as the canvas for the next stage of life. This intense focus on evolutionary self-perfection is what made her so dangerous and so uniquely terrifying, ultimately leading her to the radical decision that would define the rest of her story, the 15-year cryosleep. She was obsessed with stability. She observed that her test subjects, humans and animals, would suffer immediate mutation and death when injected with T-Veronica, because the virus was too potent for the host cells to adapt quickly. This required a profound intellectual leap. Alexia realized that the host required an incredibly lengthy incubation period to allow the virus to integrate slowly, molecule by molecule, without overwhelming the brain or the body. This breakthrough proved her genius, but it meant a voluntary 15-year hiatus from her own life. Her obsession demanded this sacrifice, proving that her commitment to evolution transcended even her immediate existence. Part 9. Alfred's fragile mind and split identity seeds. While Alexia Ashford was establishing her scientific legacy and obsession with evolution, her twin brother, Alfred Ashford, was charting a course toward complete psychological collapse. Alfred's life was tragically defined by his massive insecurity and his almost cult-like dependence on his sister. He was constantly overshadowed, and this dynamic planted the seeds of the split identity that would eventually shatter his mind. Alfred possessed a high intellect, but next to Alexia's impossible IQ of 300, he felt profoundly inadequate. He worshipped his sister, seeing her as the only source of validation, brilliance, and purpose in his isolated life. This lack of self-worth meant that when Alexia was away, whether at the university or later in cryosleep, Alfred's mental stability would crumble. He simply couldn't function without her presence, confirmation, and approval. This deep psychological fragility manifested in a terrifying and elaborate delusion. Alfred began to develop a full-blown split personality. He would retreat into the fantasy that he was his female ancestor, the legendary Veronica Ashford, whom his father had failed to resurrect. More disturbingly, he would often dress up as Alexia, adopting her mannerisms and speaking in her voice, often talking to himself in the mirror as if addressing his twin. He created a full, fictional reality where Alexia was always present, always brilliant, and always approving of him. This elaborate deceit served two psychological needs. First, it filled the void left by Alexia's absence, providing him with a constant source of his perceived authority and brilliance. Second, it allowed him to manage the sadistic, paranoid, warden persona he cultivated on Rockfort Island. By pretending to be his brilliant sister, Alfred could justify the immense cruelty and ineffective management he imposed on the facility and its inhabitants. His mental decline was not subtle. Over time, Alfred became a genuinely paranoid, sadistic warden who relied entirely on this manufactured identity to cope. He saw conspiracies everywhere, indulged in torturing the prisoners and staff, and focused more on the architectural design and security of Rockfort than on any meaningful scientific work. His entire life was a desperate performance, played out against the backdrop of a decaying, massive biological weapons facility. This psychological breakdown is a key element of the Ashford family's failure. Alexander had successfully engineered a pair of geniuses, but he failed to provide the emotional framework necessary for survival. In Alfred, we see the catastrophic result of isolation, engineered ego, and extreme sibling rivalry. His dependency on Alexia was so total that when she voluntarily left him for 15 years, his mind simply broke, turning the commander of a major umbrella facility into a whimpering, delusional sadist waiting for his only source of sanity to return. Part 10. Alexander becomes Nosferatu. The fate of Alexander Ashford serves as the brutal, horrifying punctuation mark on his life of failure and desperation, transforming him from the pathetic, flawed father into the grotesque monster known as Nosferatu. This transformation was not an accident. It was a cold, calculated act of revenge by his own genetically engineered children, Alexia and Alfred. The twins, at an astonishingly young age, discovered the dark truth about their origins through secret files. They realized they were not naturally conceived heirs, but artificial test subjects created by their father to restore the family's damaged prestige. This revelation confirmed what they already instinctively felt. Their father was weak, pathetic, and worst of all, their failed creator. In their minds, Alexander's manipulation and failure to produce natural genius was a betrayal worthy of extreme punishment. Their revenge was swift, cruel, and scientifically driven. Alexia and Alfred subjected their father to a brutal experiment using a new, highly unstable form of the T-Veronica virus. They chose the virus knowing that a stable, controlled mutation was nearly impossible, ensuring his mutation would be massive and uncontrollable. The virus ravaged Alexander's body, causing a massive, agonizing, and immediate mutation that warped him into the gigantic, horrific creature known as Nosferatu. The mutation stripped Alexander of his human mind and rendered him immobile, his legs fusing into a giant, grotesque anchor. He became a massive, churning biological engine of raw, uncontrolled power. The twins, in their ultimate act of cruelty and judgment, did not kill him. Instead, they chained the monster in the darkest dungeons of the Antarctic base, sealing him away for 15 years. This was a highly symbolic punishment. Alexander's obsession was with his ancestor Veronica and his desire to create life. The twins responded by turning him into an inhuman monster named after a vampire, chained in perpetual darkness. It was a 15-year sentence designed to reflect the duration of their own imposed existence as his failed experiments. They forced him to live as a tormented conscious monster, a biological trophy of their own superiority and genius. The creation of Nosferatu is a defining moment for the Ashford lineage. It confirms that the twins' sociopathic tendencies were fully mature, and that their loyalty extended only to their own scientific ambition. It removed the last authority figure from their lives, leaving them free to turn Rockfort Island into their own private kingdom of cruelty. Alexander's fate is the ultimate cautionary tale in the Resident Evil universe. The creator of the monsters became the most pathetic monster of all, reduced to a chained mass of viral mutation, waiting for the only source of light, the return of his daughter, to signal his final, miserable end. This gruesome punishment ensured that the power of the Ashford legacy passed entirely and irrevocably into the hands of the two brilliant, sadistic children he had engineered. Part 11. The twins seize Rockfort Island, with their father, Alexander, brutally sealed away as the monster Nosferatu. In the freezing depths of the Antarctic base, the path was finally clear for the young, sadistic twins, Alexia and Alfred, to take absolute control of their inheritance. They didn't just inherit property, they inherited the massive Umbrella research facility on Rockfort Island, and they immediately transformed it into their own private kingdom, a horrifying blend of personal playground, vast bioweapon factory, and cruel prison camp. This moment marks the true beginning of their reign of terror. Alexia was the conceptual genius, focusing on the future and her final experiment, but Alfred was the sadistic warden and the day-to-day commander. Alfred threw himself into this role, pouring his immense, though lesser, intellect into the architecture and security of the island. He didn't just manage the place, he designed the cruelty into its very structure. The mansion, the security systems, and the traps were all expressions of his developing paranoia and his need to exert control. Rockfort Island wasn't just a prison. It was a testament to the Ashford family's warped priorities. They poured vast resources into BOW research, creating creatures like the terrifying Bandersnatchers, mutants with elongated, powerful limbs designed for remote attacks. The facility was constantly stocked with prisoners and unfortunate staff members who served as involuntary test subjects for the twins' increasingly extreme viral experiments. This environment allowed Alfred to indulge his worst tendencies, confirming his transformation into a full-blown, sadistic commandant. Here's the essential point about their rule. It was driven entirely by ego and vengeance, not corporate efficiency. They used the island to satisfy their own personal, sick desires. Alfred would stalk the halls, wearing his fabricated Alexia identity, talking to himself and relishing the fear he inspired in the staff and prisoners. He saw the facility as a monument to his sister's genius and, by extension, his own perceived importance. While the other Umbrella executives saw Rockfort as a highly classified research hub, for the twins, it was a fantasy palace. They ruled with an iron, cruel fist, using the island's isolation to mask the true extent of their scientific and psychological madness. This freedom from oversight allowed their sociopathic tendencies to grow unchecked, directly contributing to the unstable and volatile nature of the BOWs created there. The legacy of their seized kingdom is one of unchecked experimentation and systematic cruelty, proving that in the hands of two emotionally stunted geniuses, a scientific facility can quickly become a personal torture chamber. This phase solidified the Ashford legacy as one of pure, unadulterated megalomania. Part 12. Alexia freezes herself for 15 years. The entire trajectory of the Ashford lineage hinged on one incredibly radical and far-sighted decision made by Alexia Ashford. She chose to freeze herself for 15 years. This was arguably the single most important, consequential decision in the entire Ashford timeline, securing her eventual success, but tragically guaranteeing her twin brother's descent into madness. Alexia was a scientific genius, but she was also a realist. As we know, the T-Veronica virus, her masterpiece creation, was brutally unstable. When injected into a host, it immediately caused massive mutation and often destroyed the host's consciousness, turning them into a mindless monster. Alexia, who was obsessed with retaining her genius and achieving the perfect mutation, could not accept this outcome. She realized that the host's cells simply could not adapt to the virus's immense potency fast enough. Her intellectual leap was brilliant. She theorized that the virus required an incredibly lengthy, controlled incubation period. By injecting herself with the virus and immediately entering cryogenic sleep for precisely 15 years, the virus would be forced to adapt to her genetic structure slowly, molecule by molecule, in a state of suspended animation. This slow integration was her key to retaining her unparalleled intellect while gaining the virus's immense power. In 1983, Alexia injected herself and entered the deep freeze at the Antarctic base. This act demonstrated her absolute commitment to biological evolution. She was willing to sacrifice 15 years of her life to ensure she emerged as the ultimate life form. This self-experimentation was the ultimate display of her hubris, her confidence that she, the engineered genius, was the only one who could achieve this stability. But here's the devastating cost. She left Alfred completely alone. The twin, whose entire psychological structure was built around his sister's presence and approval, was suddenly abandoned. This self-imposed exile, while necessary for the T-Veronica virus to work, pulled the final rug out from under Alfred's fragile mind. For 15 years, the power of the Ashford legacy and the command of Rockfort Island was left to a man whose mind was rapidly fracturing. Alexia's decision was a biological success, but a human tragedy. It preserved her genius and the virus's efficacy, but it destroyed her brother's sanity. Her cryosleep was a strategic masterpiece that ensured her eventual resurrection as the perfect viral controller, confirming her status as the superior twin. However, the resulting chaos and instability caused by Alfred's solo reign would indirectly lead to the events that brought the whole Ashford kingdom crashing down. She prioritized science over her brother's sanity, and the world paid the price for her brilliant, cold calculation. Part 13. Alfred's Reign. Alone, 15 years of decline. The 15 years following Alexia's cryosleep marked a profound, miserable period of decline for both Alfred Ashford and the Rockfort Island Research Facility. With his sister, his source of psychological stability, intellect, and authority, gone, Alfred was left alone to command a massive bioweapons operation, and his mind simply could not handle the pressure. This period is the true illustration of his deep psychological damage. Alfred's control over the facility rapidly deteriorated. He became an ineffective and cruel leader, using his power not for scientific advancement, but to indulge his escalating sadistic tendencies. The massive resources of Rockfort Island, which should have been dedicated to T-virus research and corporate profit, were instead funneled into Alfred's elaborate security measures and his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain his sanity. His split identity became his only constant companion. For 15 years, Alfred would wander the Gothic mansion and the facility, frequently dressing up as Alexia, conversing with himself, and desperately trying to maintain the illusion that his brilliant sister was still present and approving of his actions. This reliance on delusion meant that his judgment was constantly impaired. He oversaw brutal, disorganized human experimentation and created bizarre, ineffective BOWs like the Bandersnatchers, all while the core research of the facility stagnated. The atmosphere on Rockfort Island was one of pervasive paranoia and fear. Alfred's mood swings were violent, leading to arbitrary executions and extreme cruelty towards the prisoners and staff. The facility, designed to be a pinnacle of umbrella research, slowly collapsed into a chaotic, poorly managed prison camp. Alfred was less a commandant and more a child playing dress-up in a death camp, completely consumed by his waiting game. Here's the tragedy of those 15 years. Alfred's entire life was spent fixated on the return of Alexia. Every decision, every cruel act, every moment spent in delusion was predicated on the belief that once the 15 years were up, Alexia would awaken, praise him for his service, and restore order and meaning to his life. He was completely defined by this weight. This fragile mental state ensured that the moment any external stressor arrived, any event that threatened his sister's cryogenic safety, his entire psychological structure would collapse completely, leading directly to the dramatic events of Resident Evil, Code Veronica. His solo reign was a testament to his engineered fragility and the catastrophic failure of the Ashford line to produce a stable heir. Part 14. Claire Redfield arrives at Rockfort. The 15 years of Alfred's unstable, delusional rule on Rockfort Island came to a sudden, violent end in December 1998, with the entirely unplanned arrival of Claire Redfield. Her presence was the external stressor that instantly shattered Alfred's fragile world and ignited the devastating chain of events that comprise the Resident Evil, Code Veronica storyline. Claire Redfield, the younger sister of the famous STARS member Chris Redfield, was actively hunting for her brother after the events of the Raccoon City incident. Her search led her to infiltrate Umbrella's European headquarters in Paris. She was discovered, captured, and due to her connection to the famous anti-Umbrella activist Chris Redfield, she was quickly transferred to the high-security prison facility on Rockfort Island for interrogation and experimentation. Now, this is where the major turning point happens. Claire's arrival provided the perfect, catastrophic opportunity for the game's actual main antagonist, Albert Wesker. Wesker, having faked his death in Raccoon City, was working as a clandestine operative for his own organization, hunting down remnants of Umbrella's viral research. He used Claire's forced transfer to Rockfort as his window of opportunity. Wesker, operating from the shadows, orchestrated an attack that triggered a massive T-virus outbreak on the island. His goal was not just to destroy the facility, but to create enough chaos to allow him to infiltrate the base, steal vital BOW data, and most importantly, obtain a pure sample of the T-Veronica virus. Claire and her fellow prisoner, Steve Burnside, found themselves right in the middle of this chaos. Claire's escape efforts forced her to interact directly with Alfred Ashford. Alfred, already teetering on the edge of complete mental breakdown, viewed Claire's presence not as a security risk, but as a personal, malicious attack orchestrated to disrupt his precious 15-year wait for Alexia. Her arrival validated his extreme paranoia. He immediately focused his resources on hunting Claire, indulging in a sadistic cat-and-mouse game across the compound, which was rapidly filling with zombies and BOWs created by the virus release. Claire's presence exposed the facility's vulnerability and forced Alfred's instability into the open. Her persistent escape attempts and her interaction with the prison's security systems led Alfred to fully abandon any pretense of professionalism and embrace his delusional Alexia persona completely. Her capture and forced transfer inadvertently set the stage for the ultimate confrontation between the remnants of the Ashford line and the forces of anti-bioterrorism, ensuring that the fate of the entire lineage would be decided on this remote, miserable island. Part 15. Alfred's Breakdown and Last Moments. The arrival of Claire Redfield and the subsequent T-virus outbreak on Rockfort Island pushed Alfred Ashford's severely fractured mind beyond any hope of recovery, leading to his final, pathetic moments, and paradoxically, the beginning of his sister's return. This part of the story is defined by his tragic descent into total delusion. As Claire and Steve Burnside fought their way through the collapsing facility, they managed to infiltrate Alfred's central command center. Here's the shattering moment. They discovered hidden video footage that exposed Alfred's elaborate deceit. The tapes showed Alfred in his full psychological collapse, dressing up as Alexia, conversing with himself in the dual identities, confirming that the brilliant commander everyone believed was present had actually been a figment of Alfred's imagination for 15 years. This discovery shatters the last remnants of Alfred's control and exposes his profound emotional devastation to the world. With the Rockfort facility collapsing around him due to the viral chaos, Alfred fully broke down. He abandoned his command and his island, fleeing in a private submarine to the only place he felt safe and in control, the Antarctic research base where his sister was frozen. His sole, frantic purpose was no longer to fight Claire, but to reach Alexia's cryo chamber. He successfully reached the Antarctic facility, dragging his damaged mind and body through the blizzard. However, his life was violently cut short in the dungeons below the base. While trying to navigate the underground prison, he was attacked and mortally wounded by the grotesque monster he had helped create and seal away 15 years earlier. His own father, Alexander Nosferatu. It's a moment of terrible irony, the architect of the punishment finally succumbing to the monster of his own making. Alfred, critically wounded, managed to crawl his way toward Alexia's cryogenic containment pod. His final moments are incredibly poignant. Bleeding out, he reaches out to the pod, whispering his sister's name, the only word that ever truly defined his existence. He dies right there, next to the sister he spent 15 years waiting for. His death is not an end. It is a catalyst. Alfred's close proximity to the pod and his final breach of the containment area trigger a critical warning system within the Antarctic base. With the 15-year incubation period nearly complete, the system alerts Alexia's deep freeze chamber, initiating her thawing process. The fragile, pathetic life of the male Ashford twin ends, but his death ensures the dramatic, terrifying awakening of the perfect T-Veronica host, setting the stage for the final, catastrophic act of the Ashford saga. His death provides his sister with the dramatic entrance she was genetically engineered to receive. Part 16. Alexia awakens from cryosleep. The pathetic death of Alfred Ashford next to his sister's cryogenic pod was the final, tragic fulfillment of his singular life's purpose. It was the necessary trigger that signaled the dramatic, terrifying awakening of Alexia Ashford, marking the completion of her 15-year gamble and the dawn of her fully realized, perfect T-Veronica form. The entire sequence, from Alfred's collapse to Alexia's emergence, was a testament to the sheer brilliance and cold planning of the young prodigy. The warning systems and monitoring equipment built into her cryo chamber, the massive, complex infrastructure designed to protect her, were all activated by the breach and the extreme distress caused by Alfred's mortal wound. With the 15-year period almost complete, the containment systems initiated the thawing process. Alexia didn't just wake up. she emerged perfectly integrated with the T-Veronica virus. This was the moment the Ashford lineage had dreamed of for centuries. A human host gaining immense biological power while retaining their complete, terrifying intellect. The long, slow adaptation process in the deep freeze had worked exactly as she predicted. She stepped out of that pod, not as a mindlessly mutated monster, but as a graceful, utterly cold superhuman. Her immediate actions confirmed her complete control. She took charge of the chaotic situation at the Antarctic base instantaneously, demonstrating an instant mastery over the complex viral dynamics and the remaining BOWs. She was the absolute, final authority, replacing the pathetic, deceased Alfred without a moment of remorse. Her first priority was to assert her superiority and deal with the survivors who had dared to trespass on her territory, Claire Redfield and Steve Burnside, whom she immediately began to see as new, fascinating test subjects for her continued evolutionary research. This awakening changed the entire game. The battle was no longer against the shambling zombies of the T-virus or the paranoia of Alfred. It was against a sentient, genius-level bioweapon who commanded the fungal life around her and possessed the ability to spontaneously generate immense heat and flame. Alexia's goal was not merely to escape or destroy, it was to fully implement her vision of biological dominance. The T-Veronica virus granted her control over the local fauna and flora, allowing her to manipulate the environment itself. She could produce flames through the manipulation of a specific viral enzyme, a truly unique power that made her exponentially more dangerous than any viral creation before her. This control solidified her belief that she was the next stage of human evolution, a biological god in a human shell. Her genius was now backed by devastating physical reality. The problem, however, was that her resurrection immediately drew the attention of the single most dangerous operative in the world, Albert Wesker. Wesker was there to steal a sample of the virus that made her what she was, and the clash between these two supremely intelligent, morally bankrupt figures was now inevitable. Alexia's 15-year wait had paid off perfectly, but her triumph was immediately complicated by the presence of a rival who sought to claim her victory for his own ends. The perfect weapon had finally come to life, and the world was about to feel the full, terrifying force of the perfected Ashford ambition. Part 17. Albert Wesker versus Alexia. The confrontation between Alexia Ashford and Albert Wesker in the crumbling Antarctic base is one of the most intellectually charged and physically explosive showdowns in the history of Resident Evil lore. It was a clash of titans, the perfected result of the Ashford eugenics project meeting the ultimate survivor of the Spencer Project W. Both shared the same core ideology, the belief that viral evolution was necessary to create a superior race. But they were now mortal enemies, competing for the ultimate prize, the T-Veronica virus sample. Wesker, operating with his enhanced strength, speed, and vision, thanks to the experimental virus he injected himself with after faking his death, had tracked Alexia to Antarctica. His mission was cold and clinical. He needed a pure sample of T-Veronica for his own plans to develop the ultimate virus, Ouroboros. He saw Alexia not as a human being, but as a valuable biological commodity. Alexia, upon meeting Wesker, saw him as a primitive, successful test subject, a brilliant brute, but still someone who had failed to achieve her level of self-mastery. She viewed his viral enhancements as crude and unstable compared to her own graceful, controlled mutation. This mutual contempt fueled the ferocity of their encounter. The fight was shockingly one-sided, at least initially. Wesker, for all his superhuman strength, was momentarily outclassed by Alexia's T-Veronica abilities. Her ability to generate fire, manipulate BOWs, and undergo controlled, rapid, localized mutations gave her an unpredictable edge he had never encountered before. Alexia easily held the upper hand, delivering a massive, painful blow to Wesker that temporarily incapacitated him and forced him to retreat. This momentary defeat was a critical realization for Wesker. He understood that Alexia's control over her mutation and her command of the viral dynamics were superior to his own. He realized he could not simply overpower her. This forced him to adopt a more strategic, manipulative approach. The ultimate goal of this entire encounter was the sample. While Wesker managed to fight Alexia's forces and evade her direct, powerful attacks, he realized he could not defeat her without immense risk. He shifted his focus entirely to salvaging a sample of the T-Veronica virus by any means necessary. He didn't need to kill her, he just needed a piece of the genetic puzzle she represented. This confrontation establishes Alexia as one of the most powerful antagonists in the entire timeline, capable of single-handedly defeating Wesker, a feat almost no one else achieves. Wesker's temporary retreat, however, was not a sign of defeat, but a tactical repositioning. He knew that the chaos caused by the continued presence of Chris Redfield, who was also hunting Wesker, would eventually distract Alexia and create the perfect opening for him to steal the virus and continue his own dark evolutionary path. The battle was a fascinating display of biological power, ending with the master manipulator being forced to flee from the superior biological creation of the Ashford family. Part 18: Alexia's Final Mutation and Death. The final chapter of the Ashford lineage is written in fire and blood during Alexia Ashford's climactic confrontation with Chris Redfield. This sequence is the ultimate, terrifying payoff of her 15 years of planning, showcasing the immense, devastating power of the perfected T-Veronica virus before her inevitable destruction. Chris Redfield, who had followed the trail of destruction from Rockfort Island to Antarctica in pursuit of Wesker, found himself locked in a desperate battle with the very thing Wesker was hunting: Alexia. Alexia, fueled by her overwhelming superiority complex and her viral perfection, viewed Chris as nothing more than a stubborn, lower life form who needed to be efficiently exterminated to clear the way for her own escape and plan for global dominance. Alexia did not just fight Chris, she evolved. Her battle was a series of rapid, increasingly grotesque mutations, confirming the virus's immense versatility and her own controlled mastery over it. First form, controlled humanoid. Initially, Alexia fought as a graceful, powerful humanoid, using her agility and her unique ability to spontaneously generate flame through the manipulation of enzyme-rich fluid secreted from her hands. This form was already far beyond anything Chris had encountered, demanding all of his training and strength. Second form, insect, plant hybrid. When this form was damaged, she mutated into a massive, immobile, plant-like BOW, anchoring herself to the environment and using elongated limbs and acidic projectiles. This mutation showed the virus's ability to seamlessly integrate her DNA with local flora, turning her into a living biological fortress. She retained her intellect, commanding this form with cold efficiency. Third form, the queen insect. Her ultimate mutation was triggered when Chris dealt significant damage to the core of her second form. She emerged as a giant, terrifying, flying, insect-like organism, a final, desperate expression of the T-Veronica virus's power. This mutation symbolized her complete transcendence of human form, becoming the very queen she had derived the virus from. The defeat of Alexia required more than just standard weaponry. Chris had to rely on a highly experimental, specialized weapon found within the Antarctic base. The linear launcher, an anti-tyrant railgun designed to pierce the thick biological armor of large BOWs. This weapon was the only thing capable of matching the immense biological resistance provided by her perfected viral integration. Chris utilized the powerful anti-BOW launcher, delivering a massive kinetic blast directly into Alexia's vulnerable viral core in her final flying form. The sheer destructive power of the specialized weapon finally overwhelmed the T-Veronica's regenerative capacity, causing the final, catastrophic destruction of the Ashford genius. Her death marked the definitive, violent end of the Ashford genetic line and the culmination of their centuries-long, desperate quest for engineered human perfection. The family died as they lived, consumed by the monster they created. Part 19, Aftermath. Wesker gets T-Veronica samples. The absolute devastation wrought by Alexia Ashford in Antarctica was a biological catastrophe, but for Albert Wesker, it was a golden opportunity. In the chaotic, final aftermath of the confrontation between Chris and Alexia, Wesker executed his brilliant, cold-blooded plan to salvage the ultimate prize, a pure, potent sample of the T-Veronica virus. This acquisition is one of the most crucial turning points in the entire Resident Evil timeline, directly setting the stage for the global threat of Resident Evil 5. Wesker did not waste time mourning his temporary defeat by Alexia. He focused purely on the biological data he needed. His target was Steve Burnside, the young man who had accompanied Claire Redfield. During the incident, Steve had also been infected with the T-Veronica virus by Alexia, but his immune system had reacted violently, turning him into a large, grotesque BOW before Claire found him. Here's the terrible truth. When Chris and Claire found Steve, he was dying, his mutation failing. But he momentarily regained consciousness, sacrificing his life to save Claire. Wesker, operating in the shadows, was right there. He didn't care about saving Steve. He saw a unique, valuable sample. Wesker salvaged a pure sample of the T-Veronica virus directly from Steve's dying body, confirming that the virus's extreme instability in a non-engineered human still created highly desirable, mutated genetic material. This acquisition was everything to Wesker. The T-Veronica virus represented a more advanced, more controllable form of viral mutation than anything Wesker had achieved with the remnants of his Project W. This specific sample, salvaged from a natural human host, provided the genetic blueprint Wesker needed. It allowed him to understand the virus's unique properties, particularly its ability to cause fire manipulation and its extreme potency. The impact of this sample cannot be overstated. The T-Veronica virus became the essential bridge between the original Progenitor research of Umbrella's founders and Wesker's final, cataclysmic plan. Wesker would later use the T-Veronica sample, combining it with the DNA of the ancient African Stairway of the Sun flower, to successfully develop his ultimate, controlled bioweapon, the Ouroboros virus. The Ashford family may have been extinct, but their legacy lived on in Wesker's hands. Their ambition, their genius, and their cruelty were all passed on through that single viral sample. The tragedy of the Ashford lineage, their obsession with perfection, directly led to the events of Resident Evil 5, where Wesker attempted to use Ouroboros to plunge the entire world into forced evolution. The final act of the Ashford story, therefore, was not their death, but the unwitting donation of their failed evolutionary weapon to the man who would attempt to finish their work on a global scale. Part 20, The Ashford Legacy in the modern RE timeline. The Ashford family line may have ended in the frozen wastelands of Antarctica, consumed by the very biological perfection they sought. But their legacy remains one of the most powerful and tragic influences on the modern Resident Evil timeline. Their story serves as the definitive cautionary tale about the fatal consequences of unchecked eugenics, scientific arrogance, and the pursuit of biological godhood. While Spencer and Marcus focused on profitability and sheer power, the Ashford line, led by the brilliant Alexia, focused on viral control and intelligent evolution. This difference is key. The development of the T-Veronica virus represents the pinnacle of their ambition, proving that a virus could be engineered to grant immense power while retaining the host's consciousness, a goal that eluded everyone else. This obsession with stability and intelligence is what makes their contribution so long-lasting. The most direct and devastating impact is through Albert Wesker. As we know, Wesker salvaged the T-Veronica sample from Steve Burnside. That acquisition was the literal genetic key Wesker used to engineer the Ouroboros virus that became the main bioweapon in Resident Evil 5. Ouroboros adopted the core concept of T-Veronica, the idea of selective, controlled viral assimilation, and applied it using the potent African flower DNA. Therefore, the Ashford obsession ultimately enabled the last, greatest threat posed by Albert Wesker to the world. Furthermore, the Ashford lineage left a deep psychological scar on the lore. Their story highlighted that the Umbrella Corporation was always doomed, not just by the instability of the T-virus, but by the unstable personalities of its founders and their heirs. The engineered sociopathy of Alexia and Alfred proved that genius without morality is a greater threat than any bioweapon itself. They destroyed their own branch, and in doing so, created the chaos that allowed the entire Umbrella corporate structure to finally collapse. In the modern context, the Ashford history remains a dark reminder that the pursuit of biological superiority always ends in self-destruction. Their legacy is seen in every subsequent virus that attempts to grant control and power, from the various strains Wesker develops to the complex biological threats faced by organizations like the BSAA. Every time a scientist seeks to control a viral mutation for personal gain, they are walking the path first, forged by Edward Ashford's ambition and completed by Alexia's genius. The Ashford family is physically gone, but their intellectual ambition, the desire to transcend humanity through viral power, remains the enduring, underlying thematic threat of the entire series.